My name is Ramirez de la Croix, but everyone called me Ram. I was a radio DJ in Denver when Yellowstone erupted and plunged our world into an endless winter. For 93 days I have fought through freezing temperatures, violent gangs, and government conspiracies just to stay alive. This is my story of survival during the first 3 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Ramirez de la Croix, but everyone called me Ram. I was a radio DJ in Denver when Yellowstone erupted and plunged our world into an endless winter. For 93 days I have fought through freezing temperatures, violent gangs, and government conspiracies just to stay alive. This is my story of survival during the first 3 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. Right now as I speak to you, it's negative 23 degrees outside my makeshift shelter. In September, in Colorado, the thermometer should be reading 65 degrees, maybe 70 on a good day. Instead, ice covers every surface for as far as the eye can see. The world I knew, the world you knew, died exactly 93 days ago. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how it started. How normal people like you and me watch the world end in real time. June 15th started like any other Tuesday morning at Keyden radio station. I rolled into work at 5:30 in the morning, same as I had for the past 8 years. Coffee brewing in the break room, traffic reports coming in clean, weather looking perfect for a mid-June day in Denver. The morning show prep felt routine. Check the overnight logs, scan the news feeds, review the sponsor spots. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested in 12 hours our entire civilization would begin its collapse into frozen chaos. I remember sitting in that familiar booth, adjusting my headphones, running through my opening segment in my head. The morning commute was starting to pick up. People heading to jobs they thought they'd still have tomorrow. Kids getting ready for summer camps they'd never attend. Families planning vacations to places that would soon be buried under feet of volcanic ash and ice. The first emergency alert came through at 6:47 that morning. Seismic activity at Yellowstone National Park, elevated to unusual levels. I barely glanced at it. We got geological alerts all the time in Colorado. Earthquake swarms, minor. Tremors, nothing that ever amounted to much. The National Weather Service had been tracking Yellowstone's seismic patterns for decades. False alarms were more common than real threats. But something felt different about that morning. I kept getting these weird calls from truckers saying the highways were being blocked off. Military checkpoints appearing overnight on routes heading east and west out of Wyoming. Interstate 80 was being diverted at random points. Truckers with decades of experience on those roads were being turned around without explanation. When I called the Department of Transportation for clarification, they transferred me 3 times before disconnecting the call. My traffic helicopter pilot, Jenny Morrison, called in at 7:15 with reports that confused everyone in the studio. Military convoys moving south on Interstate 25. Not just a few vehicles, but dozens of trucks, personnel carriers, equipment haulers, all heading away from Wyoming at high speed. When she tried to get closer for a better look, air traffic control ordered her to maintain distance and change her flight path immediately. The emergency management coordinator for Jefferson County called the station at 7:30. He asked to speak with me directly, which never happened. Emergency officials dealt with our news director, not the morning show DJ. But there he was, asking if I had my personal radio equipment ready at home. When I asked why, he said to keep it operational, just in case. Just in case of what? I asked. He said he couldn't discuss it over open phone lines, but suggested I make sure my backup power supplies were fully charged. That conversation haunted me for the rest of the morning. Emergency management doesn't make casual suggestions about backup radio equipment. They don't tell DJs to prepare personal broadcasting gear unless they expect the main station to go offline. I started mentally cataloging my ham radio setup at home. Solar panels, battery banks, antenna configurations. Equipment I'd installed. As a hobby, never thinking I'd need it for actual emergencies. My buddy Jake in the weather department kept muttering about temperature projections he was reviewing. Numbers that didn't make sense, he said. Computer models showing dramatic temperature drops across the northern hemisphere. When I asked to see the data, he closed his laptop and said it was probably just a software glitch. But Jake had been a meteorologist for 15 years. He knew the difference between software errors and genuine forecasts. The second emergency alert arrived at 8:23. Yellowstone caldera showing signs of potential eruption. All air traffic over Wyoming grounded immediately. Evacuation recommendations for areas within a 50-mile radius of the park. This was no longer routine seismic activity. This was the beginning of something catastrophic. I went live on air with the first official announcement about Yellowstone's elevated threat level. Told listeners to stay tuned for updates. Advised against travel to Wyoming. Recommended following official evacuation orders if they lived near the park. Standard emergency broadcasting protocol. But even as I read the script, I could feel something massive building on the horizon. The phone started ringing immediately. People calling from Cheyenne, from Casper, from small towns across Wyoming. They were seeing things that didn't match the official reports. Military helicopters evacuating government facilities. Convoys of emergency vehicles heading away from population centers. Families being told to pack essential items and leave their homes within hours. One caller claimed to be a geological survey technician working near the park. He said the readings they were getting were beyond anything in recorded history. Magma chambers showing pressure levels that indicated an imminent major eruption. Not just an eruption, but a supervolcanic event that could affect global weather patterns for years. Before he could provide more details, the call disconnected. When I tried calling the number back, it was no longer in service. At 9:15, Jake pulled me aside during a commercial break. His face was pale, hands shaking as he showed me his computer screen. Temperature models for the next 6 months. Every projection showed dramatic cooling across North America, Europe, Asia. Average temperatures dropping by 20 to 30 degrees. Growing seasons completely eliminated. Winter conditions lasting through what should have been spring and summer. I asked him where these projections were coming from. He said multiple climate modeling centers were running the same scenarios. All based on the assumption of a major volcanic eruption releasing massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The kind of eruption that blocks sunlight for months or years. The kind of eruption that triggers volcanic winters lasting longer than most civilizations. We were interrupted by emergency alerts flooding every communication channel simultaneously. Yellowstone caldera eruption confirmed. Massive ash cloud forming. All aircraft grounded across the western United States. Interstate highways closing. In multiple states. This was no longer a potential threat. This was happening right now. I rushed back to the booth and broke into regular programming. Announced the confirmed eruption, advised listeners to seek shelter indoors, warned about ash inhalation dangers. But even as I delivered the emergency information, I could see through the studio windows that something was changing outside. The bright June morning was getting darker. Not cloudy, but dark in a way that felt wrong for midday. The ash cloud reached Denver at 11:45 that morning. I watched through the studio windows as our sunny Tuesday transformed into an apocalyptic twilight. Gray particles began falling like snow, coating cars, buildings, everything outside in a thick blanket of volcanic debris. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 30 minutes. People on the street were stopping, looking up at the sky, trying to understand what they were seeing. Our station manager decided to switch to emergency broadcasting mode. Cancel all regular programming. Focus entirely on crisis information and coordination with emergency services. The phones were ringing constantly. People trapped in their cars as ash clogged air filters and engines died. Families separated when schools went into lockdown and parents couldn't reach their children. Hospitals reporting sudden increases in respiratory emergencies. I spent the next 6 hours coordinating between emergency services and desperate callers, relaying information about shelter locations, medical facilities still operational, safe routes for emergency vehicles. The city's emergency management center was overwhelmed. They needed every available communication channel to reach people across the metro area. But it was during those first hours of the ashfall that I started noticing patterns that didn't fit the official story. Emergency services had response plans that seemed too detailed, too specific for an event that was supposed to be unexpected. Shelter locations that had been prepared in advance. Supply distribution points that were already stocked and staffed. Communication protocols that suggested weeks of preparation rather than improvised crisis response. The emergency management director pulled me aside during a brief break in the chaos. He said I should go home and make sure my personal radio equipment was operational. When I asked why, he looked around nervously and said the main station might lose power within days. Backup generators wouldn't last indefinitely. If I wanted to keep broadcasting to help people, I needed to be prepared to operate independently. That conversation changed everything for me. It meant they knew the power grid was going to fail. They knew this crisis would last longer than emergency generators could sustain. They were planning for societal infrastructure to collapse completely. And they were telling me, a morning show DJ, to prepare for independent broadcasting operations. I left the station at 6 that evening, driving home through streets already transformed beyond recognition. The ash was 3 inches deep and still falling. Cars abandoned everywhere as engines failed. People walking with shirts over their faces, trying to breathe through the toxic air. Street lights creating eerie circles of visibility in what felt like perpetual dusk. My apartment building was chaos. Residents gathering in the lobby, sharing information and fears. The building manager was handing out surgical masks and plastic sheeting to cover windows and vents. Everyone was asking the same questions. How long would this last? When would the ash stop falling? Whether it was safe to go outside at all. I spent that first night setting up my ham radio equipment on the apartment building roof. Solar panels secured against the ashfall. Battery banks charged and ready. Antenna systems optimized for long-distance communication. Equipment I'd installed as a hobby was now becoming a lifeline for community communication. The first week felt like the world's strangest snow day. Kids were playing in the gray ash, building ashmen instead of snowmen. People were taking pictures, posting on social media about the weird weather. Stores were busy but not panicked. Most people seemed to think this was temporary. A few days of cleanup and everything would return to normal. But the temperature kept dropping, day by day, degree by degree. July 4th weekend brought the first killing frost in Denver's recorded summer history. Pipes began bursting throughout the city as water lines froze. Gardens that should have been thriving in midsummer were dying from cold and lack of sunlight. The growing season was ending before it had really begun. I was broadcasting from the station during the day and from my apartment at night, coordinating between official emergency services and the growing network of ham radio operators who were filling gaps in communication coverage. We were becoming the informal information network for people trying to navigate this new reality. 2 weeks after the eruption, I started getting calls from people whose relatives had disappeared. Not missing in the chaos, but systematically evacuated by government agencies. Families told their loved ones had been relocated to safe areas for their own protection. But no one could explain where these safe areas were located or when people would be allowed to return. The grocery stores were emptying rapidly, not from panic buying, but because supply chains were completely disrupted. Trucks couldn't navigate. Roads covered in ash. Drivers were abandoning routes rather than risk engine failure in remote areas. Food distribution centers were shutting down as equipment failed and staff relocated to other regions. I remember one particular call that changed my perspective on everything happening around us. A woman named Sarah calling from a suburban neighborhood, saying government vehicles had been going house to house, documenting who was still in residence and what resources they had available. She said the officials were polite but thorough, asking detailed questions about food supplies, medical needs, technical skills, and family compositions. When I asked her what agency these officials represented, she said they wouldn't identify themselves beyond showing federal identification badges. They said they were conducting wellness checks and resource assessments to coordinate relief efforts. But something about their questions felt more like intelligence gathering than humanitarian assistance. That call came in on day 14. I remember it specifically because it was the night I got another call that changed everything. A voice I didn't recognize, speaking carefully like someone who knew their communications might be monitored. The caller asked if I was prepared for the long dark. When I asked what he meant, he said the ash cloud was just the beginning. The real challenge would be the years of cooling that followed major volcanic eruptions. He gave me coordinates. Supply. Drop locations, he said, for people who understood what was coming and were prepared to help others survive the transition. When I asked who he was, he said he was a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, but he couldn't stay on the line long. Before hanging up, he said I should document everything I was seeing. Keep records of who was being evacuated and why. The official story wouldn't match what was really happening. That call haunted me through the rest of the second week. Years of cooling meant this wasn't a temporary disaster followed by recovery. This was a fundamental change to our climate and civilization. And someone with inside knowledge was suggesting that official responses were not what they appeared to be. I started keeping detailed logs of everything. Which neighborhoods lost power first, which areas were being evacuated, which families were being separated and relocated. There were patterns emerging that didn't match random disaster response. Resources were being consolidated in specific areas. People with certain skills were being identified and moved. Others were being left to manage on their own with minimal support. The power grid started failing in rolling blackouts during the third week. Our radio station was running on backup generators, but fuel deliveries were becoming unreliable. I could see the writing on the wall. Within days or weeks, we'd lose the ability to broadcast from the main facility. My home radio setup was becoming more important with each passing day. On day 20, I found documents that had been left behind by station management. Evacuation plans for essential personnel. Lists of people who would be relocated to secure facilities if the situation deteriorated further. My name wasn't on any of those lists. Neither were the names of most of the technical staff who actually kept the station operational. That's when I realized we were being sorted, divided into categories of useful and expendable. People with connections and resources were being moved to safety. Everyone else was expected to manage independently or not survive at all. The radio station would eventually be abandoned like everything else that wasn't considered essential for the new reality being created. I spent the final days of those first 3 weeks building relationships with other ham radio operators across the region. People who understood that official communication channels would eventually fail. We were creating an informal network that could function independently of government systems and corporate infrastructure. By day 30, most of my colleagues had left Denver. Some evacuated to family in warmer climates. Others relocated through official programs that promised safety and security in exchange for their technical skills. I was alone at the station. Most days, broadcasting to whoever was still listening, coordinating with emergency services that were becoming increasingly overwhelmed and understaffed. The mass exodus was visible from the station windows. Highways clogged with vehicles heading south, loaded with everything people could carry. Families abandoning homes they'd lived in for decades, hoping to find warmth in states that might not freeze completely. But I'd seen the weather projections Jake had shown me. The cooling was global. There was nowhere warm left to run to. That's when I got the call that changed everything. A voice I didn't recognize, speaking in code, asking if I was prepared for the long dark. I wasn't. None of us were. The caller who asked if I was prepared for the long dark turned out to be Dr. Michael Chun, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service who had been reassigned to a classified weather monitoring station in Colorado Springs. He was breaking every protocol by contacting me, but he said the official information being released to the public was deliberately incomplete and misleading. Dr. Chun explained that the Yellowstone eruption had released approximately 2.5 cubic miles of volcanic material into the atmosphere. The ash and sulfur dioxide were creating a barrier that would block significant amounts of sunlight for at least 18 to 24 months. Global temperatures would drop by an average of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In regions like Colorado, we could expect temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees below normal for extended periods. This wasn't a temporary disruption that would clear up in a few months. This was a volcanic winter that would eliminate growing seasons across most of North America and Europe. Food production would collapse. Supply chains would fail completely. Billions of people would face starvation and exposure. The eruption had triggered a global catastrophe that would reshape human civilization. But the most disturbing information Dr. Chun shared was about the government's response. Federal agencies had been planning for this scenario for years. Not planning to prevent it, but planning to manage the aftermath. Population reduction was considered inevitable and necessary. Resources would be concentrated in specific areas to maintain essential government functions and preserve selected populations. He gave me coordinates for supply cache locations around Denver. Stockpiles that had been positioned months before the eruption. Food, medical supplies, communication equipment, fuel, weapons. Enough resources to support small groups of survivors for extended periods. But the caches were numbered, and he emphasized that other people had access to the same information. After that call, I started viewing everything differently. The evacuation programs weren't random humanitarian efforts. They were selection processes. People with useful skills were being relocated to secure facilities. Others were being abandoned to face the volcanic winter with minimal support. The government was actively deciding who would survive and who wouldn't. The power grid failures weren't just infrastructure damage from the ash. They were controlled shutdowns designed to consolidate electrical generation in specific areas. Rolling blackouts were becoming permanent blackouts as power plants were systematically deactivated. The outer neighborhoods of Denver were being cut loose first, with resources concentrated in the downtown core. I kept detailed logs of which areas lost power and when. There was definitely a pattern. Lower-income neighborhoods went dark first. Areas with older infrastructure were abandoned quickly. But wealthy districts and government facilities maintained power even as surrounding areas were shut down. This wasn't random system failure. This was deliberate resource allocation. The radio station was running on backup generators that were supposed to last 72 hours in emergency situations. But fuel deliveries had become unreliable, and station management was making decisions about how to allocate remaining generator time. Regular programming was eliminated completely. We were broadcasting emergency information for a few hours each day, then shutting down to conserve fuel. My colleagues were leaving in groups as corporate evacuation plans were implemented. The station's parent company had arrangements with facilities in warmer climates where essential personnel could continue. Broadcasting operations. Technical staff with specialized skills were being relocated to maintain network infrastructure in designated safe zones. But I wasn't on any evacuation list. Neither were most of the local employees who actually knew the Denver market and had relationships with the community. We were considered expendable. When the station was eventually abandoned, we'd be left behind with everyone else who wasn't deemed valuable enough to save. I found the evacuation documents in the station manager's office after he left for Phoenix. Detailed plans for relocating. Equipment and personnel to multiple backup sites. Lists of people authorized for transport to secure facilities. Communication protocols for maintaining network operations during the transition period. Everything was planned months in advance. My name appeared on exactly one list. Personnel to be terminated when the facility was abandoned. Not terminated as in fired. Terminated as in eliminated. The document was very specific about security protocols for preventing unauthorized access to evacuated facilities. Former employees who remained in disaster areas were considered potential security threats. That's when I realized I needed to disappear from their radar completely. Stop using the station's communication systems. Stop following their protocols. Start operating independently before they decided I knew too much about their plans. I began secretly transferring equipment to my apartment and building alternative communication capabilities. Other ham radio operators were reaching out with similar stories. Government employees being reassigned or terminated. Corporate facilities being abandoned with little warning. Technical personnel being separated into categories of essential and expendable. We were creating an informal network of people who had been left behind by the official evacuation programs. The conversations I was having with other operators revealed the scope of what was happening across the region. Supply caches were being systematically emptied by teams with advanced knowledge of their locations. Survivors who found cache sites were often finding them already cleaned out. Someone with inside information was getting there first. We started sharing intelligence about resource locations and safe routes between survivors. But we also started noticing that some of the voices on our network would disappear suddenly. Operators who had been checking in daily would simply stop transmitting. Their last known locations would go silent. We began to suspect that someone was monitoring our communications and tracking our positions. By day 35, I was essentially operating alone at the radio station, broadcasting for a few hours each day, then shutting down to conserve fuel and avoid detection. The city felt increasingly empty as most of the population had either evacuated or died from exposure and starvation. Emergency services were operating with skeleton crews focused on protecting designated safe zones. I made the decision to abandon the station permanently and transition to full-time independent broadcasting from my apartment. The corporate evacuation was scheduled for day 40, and I didn't want to be anywhere near the facility when security teams arrived to implement their termination protocols. It was time to disappear completely. Loading my personal vehicle with our ADIO equipment, emergency supplies, and backup power systems, I felt like I was stealing from my own workplace. But the equipment would be abandoned anyway when the facility was evacuated. At least this way, it would continue serving the community instead of being destroyed or relocated to serve people in secure government facilities. The drive home through Denver's empty streets was surreal. Most businesses were closed permanently. Abandoned vehicles everywhere, either out of fuel or disabled by ash damage. Streetlights functioning sporadically as the power grid continued failing in sections. The few people I saw were moving quickly, heads down, avoiding contact with strangers. My apartment building was maybe half occupied. Most residents had left for warmer climates or been evacuated through various government programs. The building Manager had abandoned his post, leaving residents to manage heating, security, and maintenance independently. We were forming an informal community of people who had nowhere else to go. Setting up my broadcasting equipment in my apartment felt like establishing a resistance operation. I was creating communication capabilities that operated outside official channels, no corporate oversight, no government monitoring, no evacuation protocols. Just direct communication between survivors trying to help each other navigate the collapse of civilization. The first night broadcasting from my apartment, I made contact with Sarah, a former emergency management coordinator who had refused evacuation orders. She was operating from a suburban neighborhood, coordinating between families who had decided to stay in Denver rather than risk the journey south. Her information about government activities was both valuable and terrifying. Sarah confirmed that evacuation programs were selection processes. Families were being separated based on assessments of their usefulness and resource requirements. Children were being placed in facilities separate from their parents. Adults with valuable skills were being relocated to work camps disguised as refugee centers. Others were being transported to remote areas and abandoned. She had intercepted communications between government facilities discussing population reduction targets. The volcanic winter was being used as an opportunity to eliminate surplus population and consolidate resources under centralized control. Survival was not about helping people weather the crisis. It was about determining who deserved to survive the transition to a new social order. The supply caches Dr. Chun had told me about were real, but accessing them was dangerous. Teams of former military personnel were monitoring the sites and eliminating unauthorized survivors who attempted to access the resources. The caches were intended for government-selected groups, not random survivors who had learned their locations. I started mapping the cache locations anyway, sharing information with other ham radio operators who were coordinating survivor networks. We developed protocols for safely approaching supply sites and methods for determining whether they were being monitored. Most were too dangerous to approach directly, but some had been overlooked or abandoned by the monitoring teams. During my second week of independent broadcasting, I encountered Marcus Williams, a former security guard who had been living in my apartment building since the evacuation programs began. He approached me about cooperating on scavenging operations. Two people could cover more ground and watch each other's backs while searching abandoned buildings for supplies. Marcus seemed knowledgeable about urban survival and had useful skills for navigating the dangerous environment Denver had become. He knew which buildings were structurally sound, which areas were being patrolled by security teams, and which routes were safe for moving supplies. We formed a temporary partnership for mutual survival. But I started noticing that Marcus had better information about resource locations than someone in his position should have possessed. He knew which stores had been cleaned out and which still contained useful supplies. He knew which government facilities had been abandoned and which were still occupied. His knowledge seemed too detailed for casual observation. We worked together for about 10 days, successfully scavenging food, medical supplies, and equipment from abandoned businesses and residences. Marcus was efficient and professional, but I noticed he was particularly interested in my radio equipment and the information I was sharing with other survivors. He asked detailed questions about my broadcast schedule and the locations of people I was coordinating with. The breakthrough came when I discovered a cache site that should have been secret. Dr. Chun had given me coordinates for 15 supply locations around Denver. I had found 7 of them already cleaned out by professional teams. But location number 8 still contained most of its original supplies. Medical equipment, military rations, communication gear, winter clothing, and fuel. As I was documenting the cache contents and preparing to share the location with other survivors, Marcus arrived at the site. He claimed to have followed me, but he was carrying equipment that suggested he had known about the cache independently. When I confronted him about his knowledge of the supply locations, he became evasive and defensive. That night I monitored radio communications using equipment Marcus didn't know I possessed. I intercepted transmissions between Marcus and an unknown coordinator, reporting on my activities and the information I was sharing with other survivors. He was providing detailed intelligence about survivor locations, resource caches, and communication networks. Marcus was working for the same government operation that was systematically eliminating independent survivors. He had been assigned to monitor my activities and gather intelligence about the informal networks that were forming among people who had been left behind by the official evacuation programs. I was being set up for termination. I had to make a decision quickly. Confront Marcus and risk immediate elimination, or disappear before he could complete his mission. I chose to disappear. Packing essential equipment and supplies, I abandoned my apartment and moved into Denver's underground tunnel system where I could continue broadcasting while avoiding detection. The tunnels beneath Denver were a world unto themselves. Steam and utility passages, abandoned subway construction, storm drainage systems, all connected in a network that extended throughout the metropolitan area. Other survivors had found refuge there. People who had learned to stay hidden from the systematic elimination operations happening above ground. Living in the tunnels was brutal. Cold, damp, dangerous. Structural collapses from the weight of ash and ice, flooding from broken water mains, air quality problems from poor ventilation. But it was safer than remaining above ground where government teams were hunting for unauthorized survivors. I established a new broadcasting location in an abandoned utility chamber with access to electrical systems and ventilation. Using battery power and carefully managed transmission schedules, I maintained contact with the survivor network while remaining hidden from detection. But the psychological stress of underground living was taking its toll on everyone who had sought refuge there. The tunnels weren't empty. There were sounds that weren't easily explained. Movement in areas that should have been unoccupied. Other survivors whispered about things they had seen in the deeper passages. People who had been changed by starvation and desperation. Groups that had given up on maintaining their humanity in exchange for survival. Some of the tunnel communities had devolved into primitive territories controlled by violence and intimidation. Resources were hoarded by the strongest. Weaker survivors were exploited or eliminated. The collapse of surface civilization had triggered a regression to the most basic survival instincts among people who had lost hope of rescue or recovery. But there were also communities that maintained cooperation and mutual support. Families and individuals who shared resources and protected each other. People who were determined to preserve their humanity despite the desperate circumstances. These groups became the foundation for organized resistance against the systematic elimination programs. Sarah's voice came through the radio static during my third week in the tunnels. She had coordinates for a meeting location where survivors were organizing to fight back against the government teams that were hunting them. People with military experience, technical skills, and knowledge of the elimination operations were forming a resistance network. The meeting was scheduled for dawn at an abandoned warehouse in an industrial area that had been mostly evacuated. Sarah emphasized that getting there would require crossing territory controlled by groups that were actively collaborating with the government elimination programs. The resistance was real, but so were the risks of trying to join it. I spent hours preparing for the journey, selecting essential equipment, planning routes through areas I hoped were not being monitored, identifying backup locations if the primary meeting site was compromised. The decision to leave the relative safety of the tunnels was dangerous, but isolation was not a viable long-term survival strategy. As I prepared my equipment for transport, I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice coming through the radio. A recording of one of my broadcasts, but edited to include information I had never shared. locations of survivor groups, resource cache coordinates, communication frequencies. They had been listening all along, recording everything, and now they were using my voice to manipulate other survivors. If they could fake my broadcasts, they could turn every survivor against each other. Trust was the only thing keeping us alive, and they were weaponizing my credibility to destroy the networks we had built. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated than anything I had imagined. They weren't just hunting us physically. They were destroying us from within. The attack was set for dawn. But as I prepared my equipment, I realized that reaching the meeting location alive would require more than just avoiding detection. It would require outsmarting people who had been monitoring my every move for weeks. People who knew my patterns, my contacts, and my plans. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about war. The recording of my voice broadcasting false information changed everything. They weren't just monitoring our communications. They were actively using our own voices against us, creating fake broadcasts to manipulate survivor behavior and destroy the trust that held our networks together. I realized I had walked directly into a sophisticated psychological warfare operation. I made the decision to risk the journey to Sarah's meeting location, but I changed my route completely. Instead of taking the direct path through the tunnel system, I surfaced in an area I had never broadcast from before. If they were tracking my movement patterns, I needed to become completely unpredictable. The warehouse district where Sarah had scheduled the meeting was a wasteland of abandoned industrial buildings. Most facilities had been evacuated when the power grid failed and transportation systems collapsed. But the area also provided excellent cover for surveillance operations. Anyone watching the meeting location would have multiple positions to observe from without being detected. I arrived 2 hours early and spent time observing the warehouse from different angles, looking for signs of surveillance, unusual activity, or evidence that the meeting location had been compromised. What I found was disturbing. Fresh tire tracks in the ash, despite the fact that most vehicles in the city had been abandoned weeks ago. Someone with operational vehicles had been using this area recently. More concerning were the modifications I noticed to some of the surrounding buildings. Antenna installations that hadn't been there before. Equipment that looked like communication. Monitoring gear. Windows that had been blocked except for small observation ports. This area was being used as a surveillance and operations center. Sarah arrived exactly on schedule, but she wasn't alone. 3 other people accompanied her, all carrying equipment that suggested they had access to resources beyond what typical survivors should possess. When I approached the group, I immediately sensed that something was wrong with the entire situation. Sarah introduced her companions as other former emergency management personnel who had refused evacuation orders. But their equipment was too new, too sophisticated, and too well maintained for people who had been surviving independently for over a month. They had access to supply chains that regular survivors didn't. The meeting felt like an interrogation, disguised as coordination. They asked detailed questions about my broadcasting operations, the locations of other survivors I had been in contact with, and the communication frequencies we were using. When I asked about their plans for organizing resistance operations, their answers were vague and evasive. I started testing them with false information to see how they would respond. Mentioned fake resource locations, non-existent survivor groups, and communication frequencies that didn't exist. Within an hour, I intercepted radio traffic discussing the false information I had provided. They were immediately reporting everything I said to their handlers. The resistance meeting was a trap. Sarah and her companions were working for the same elimination operation that Marcus had been reporting to. They were using my reputation and credibility to gather intelligence about survivor networks, then providing that information to teams that would systematically eliminate everyone involved. I needed to escape the situation without revealing that I had discovered their true purpose. Pretending to be convinced by their coordination plans, I agreed to provide them with detailed information about my communication network. But instead of real intelligence, I gave them carefully crafted disinformation designed to waste their resources and protect actual survivors. The escape from the warehouse district required all of my urban survival skills, moving through areas with limited visibility, avoiding routes that were likely being monitored, and constantly changing direction to prevent tracking. They had vehicles and communication equipment. I had knowledge of the city and desperation to stay alive. I made it back to the tunnel system, but I knew my previous hiding location was compromised. Marcus had detailed knowledge of my movements and broadcasting schedules. Sarah's team had information about my equipment and operational methods. I needed to establish completely new protocols and find different people to work with. The tunnels had changed during the time I had been above ground. New arrivals had found refuge in the underground spaces, but so had new dangers. Some of the survivor communities had been infiltrated by people working for the elimination operations. Trust was becoming impossible to establish or maintain. I encountered a group of survivors who had been living in the storm drainage system for several weeks. Families with children, elderly people who couldn't make the journey south, individuals with medical conditions that made evacuation impossible. They were the people who had been abandoned by every official program, left to survive or die on their own. These survivors had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and finding resources in the abandoned city above. They knew which buildings were being monitored, which routes were safe for scavenging operations, and which areas were controlled by hostile groups. Their intelligence was more reliable than anything I had received from official sources. But they also reported disturbing information about what was happening in other parts of the tunnel system. Survivor communities that had been systematically eliminated by teams of armed personnel. Bodies found in passages that had been sealed after the killings. Evidence of executions rather than deaths from starvation or exposure. The elimination operations weren't just targeting individual survivors who posed security threats. They were systematically clearing the entire underground population. The tunnels were being sanitized to eliminate anyone who might emerge later to challenge the new social order being established above ground. I realized that my broadcasting operations were putting these innocent families at risk. My radio transmissions could be tracked to general areas, and elimination teams would search entire tunnel sections to find broadcasting equipment. By operating from underground locations, I was creating targets for operations that would kill everyone in the surrounding areas. The decision to separate myself from other survivors was one of the most difficult I had made since the crisis began. These people needed communication networks to coordinate resources and avoid dangers. But my presence was making them targets for systematic elimination. I had to find ways to help them while maintaining operational security for everyone involved. I established new broadcasting protocols that were much more careful about operational security. Shorter transmission times, constantly changing frequencies, never broadcasting from the same location twice. Instead of maintaining regular schedules that could be predicted, I moved to random transmission patterns that would be harder to track. The new protocols were effective for avoiding detection, but they made coordination with other survivors much more difficult. People couldn't find my broadcasts reliably. Information sharing became sporadic and incomplete. The networks we had built to help each other were being destroyed by the security measures necessary to avoid elimination. During my second week of operating under the new protocols, I made contact with a survivor who identified himself as Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a former Air Force logistics officer who had refused evacuation orders. He claimed to be coordinating resistance operations among military personnel who had been abandoned by official evacuation programs. Morrison had detailed information about the elimination operations, including command structures, operational methods, and planned target areas. He claimed that significant numbers of military personnel had refused to participate in population reduction operations and were working to protect civilian survivors from systematic elimination. But Morrison's information was too detailed and too current for someone who was operating independently. He knew about operations that were happening in real time, with precision that suggested he had access to current intelligence briefings. His knowledge raised the same red flags I had learned to recognize with Marcus and Sarah's team. I started providing Morrison with the same type of disinformation I had used with Sarah's group. False survivor locations, non-existent resource caches, fake communication schedules. Within hours, I intercepted radio traffic discussing the false information, confirming that Morrison was also working for the elimination operations. The pattern was becoming clear. They were infiltrating survivor networks with people who had plausible cover stories and useful skills. These operatives would gain trust by providing valuable information and assistance, then gather intelligence that would be used to eliminate entire groups of survivors. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and effective. Every contact with other survivors carried the risk of betrayal. Every piece of information shared could be used to eliminate people you were trying to help. Isolation was dangerous, but cooperation was potentially fatal. I began developing methods for testing the reliability of other survivors without putting anyone at risk. Creating false information that could be traced if it was reported to elimination teams. Establishing multiple layers of communication that would reveal if someone was sharing intelligence with hostile organizations. These methods identified several other operatives who were working to infiltrate survivor communities. People with impressive credentials and valuable resources who were using their positions to gather intelligence for elimination operations. The scope of the infiltration was much larger than I had originally realized. But the testing also identified genuine survivors who were working independently to help other people navigate the crisis. Individuals who had refused official evacuation programs and were committed to helping their communities survive. These people became the foundation for building more secure communication networks. The genuine survivors included former emergency services personnel, military veterans, medical professionals, and technical specialists who had the skills needed to maintain basic services and coordinate resources. They were working separately from official programs, but they weren't working against other survivors. Building trust with verified survivors allowed us to share more detailed information about the elimination operations and develop more effective countermeasures. We created secure communication protocols, established safe routes between different areas of the city, and coordinated resource sharing that avoided detection by monitoring teams. The resistance network that emerged from these careful connections was small but effective. Instead of trying to organize large groups that would be vulnerable to infiltration and elimination, we operated as independent cells that shared information and resources while maintaining operational security. Each cell operated autonomously, with minimal contact between groups to prevent compromise. If one cell was eliminated or infiltrated, the others could continue operating without being affected. This structure was more secure, but it also made coordination more difficult and limited our ability to conduct large-scale operations. The intelligence we gathered about elimination operations revealed that they were preparing for a major escalation. Instead of hunting individual survivors or small groups, they were planning coordinated sweeps of entire areas. Neighborhoods would be surrounded and systematically cleared. No survivors would be left behind. The timeline for these major operations was tied to weather patterns and resource availability. As winter deepened and food supplies became more scarce, the elimination teams would accelerate their operations. The goal was to complete population reduction before spring, when survivors might have better chances of establishing sustainable communities. This intelligence created an urgent need to warn other survivors and help them prepare for what was coming, but increased communication to spread warnings would also increase the risk of detection and elimination. We had to balance the need to help people with the need to maintain operational security. The warnings we managed to transmit helped some survivor groups relocate to safer areas or improve their security measures. But we also lost contact with groups that were discovered and eliminated before they could implement protective measures. Every success was accompanied by failures that cost lives. The psychological toll of operating under constant threat of elimination was affecting everyone in the resistance network. The stress of never knowing who could be trusted, combined with the knowledge that innocent people were being systematically killed, was pushing some people beyond their breaking point. Some survivors chose to surrender to official programs rather than continue living under constant threat. Others became paranoid and hostile, viewing all contact with other people as potential threats. The elimination operations were achieving their goals by destroying social cohesion among survivor populations. But there were also people who became more determined to resist as the scope of the elimination operations became clear. People who understood that surrender meant participation in their own extinction. These individuals formed the core of organized resistance efforts that would eventually challenge the elimination operations directly. The transition from defensive survival to active resistance began when we intercepted communications about a planned major sweep of the downtown area. Hundreds of survivors were living in buildings throughout the central city. The elimination operation would surround the entire area and systematically clear every building over a period of several days. We had 48 hours to organize an evacuation or mount a defense. Neither option had a high probability of success, but allowing the operation to proceed unopposed would result in the elimination of everyone who had managed to survive in the downtown area for more than 2 months. The decision to actively resist rather than simply avoid elimination operations marked a fundamental change in our approach to survival. We were no longer just trying to stay alive. We were trying to prevent the systematic extinction of everyone who had been abandoned by official programs. As I prepared my equipment for what would become our first coordinated resistance operation, I intercepted radio traffic that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming through the radio. A recording. They had been listening all along, and now they were using my broadcasts to manipulate other survivors into revealing their locations. The attack was set for dawn. Sarah grabbed my radio. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them about the bunkers. About what's really happening." Then she was gone into the smoke, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about the resistance was about to change. The recording of my voice broadcasting false coordinates to lure survivors into elimination zones changed the entire nature of our resistance operations. They weren't just hunting us with conventional tactics. They were using our own communication networks against us, turning our voices into weapons that would destroy the trust holding our communities together. Sarah's final transmission before disappearing into the smoke of that first battle gave me coordinates that led to something far more disturbing than anything I had discovered about the elimination operations. Underground facilities that had been constructed years before the Yellowstone eruption. Bunkers designed to house selected populations during exactly the kind of global catastrophe we were experiencing. The coordinates led me to a concealed entrance beneath an abandoned government building in downtown Denver. The facility extended multiple levels underground, with power systems, air filtration, communication equipment, and supplies to sustain hundreds of people for years. This wasn't emergency construction. This was long-term planning for a disaster they knew was coming. Documents I found in the facility revealed the true scope of what was happening across the country. The volcanic winter wasn't just a natural disaster being managed by emergency services. It was a planned population reduction event designed to eliminate surplus humans and establish a new social order under centralized control. The elimination operations targeting independent survivors were coordinated from facilities like this. 1. Teams of former military and law enforcement personnel were being directed by government officials who had been safely relocated to underground bunkers before the eruption occurred. They were systematically clearing areas that would be needed for post-disaster reconstruction. The bunker contained detailed maps showing planned survival zones, elimination zones, and resource consolidation areas. Most of the American population was designated for elimination. Only areas with strategic resources or military significance were designated for long-term occupation. Denver was marked as a resource consolidation zone, meaning all independent survivors would be eliminated and the area prepared for reoccupation by approved populations. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the Yellowstone eruption itself might not have been entirely natural. Seismic monitoring data showed unusual patterns of underground detonations in the months preceding the eruption. Someone had been conducting operations designed to destabilize the volcanic system and trigger a major eruption. Whether the eruption was natural or artificially triggered, the response was definitely planned years in advance. The elimination operations, the underground facilities, the resource consolidation plans, all of it was prepared before the disaster occurred. This wasn't crisis management. This was the implementation of a pre-existing plan to reshape human civilization. I transmitted this information to every survivor network I could reach, but I also realized that doing so would make me the highest priority target for elimination operations. The people running this program couldn't allow evidence of their advanced planning to become widely known. They would commit significant resources to stopping me from spreading this information. The response came within hours. Coordinated attacks on every known resistance cell in the Denver area. Teams of armed personnel systematically clearing buildings where survivors had established communities. The attacks were simultaneous and precisely targeted, using intelligence that could only have come from extensive surveillance operations. Our resistance network was being systematically destroyed. Cells that had operated independently for weeks were being eliminated within hours of each other. The operational security that had protected us was being overcome by resources and intelligence, capabilities that exceeded anything we had anticipated. I barely escaped the attack on my current location, losing most of my equipment and supplies in the process. The elimination team that hit my building was professional and thorough. They knew exactly where to look for broadcasting equipment and how to neutralize communication capabilities without destroying useful resources. Other survivors reported similar attacks across the metropolitan area. Families that had been living quietly in abandoned buildings were being systematically executed. Communities that had developed sustainable resource sharing were being eliminated completely. The goal wasn't just to eliminate resistance organizations. It was to eliminate all independent survivors. The few resistance members who escaped the coordinated attacks gathered at an emergency meeting location in the industrial district. We had lost more than half of our people and most of our equipment. The survivors who remained were demoralized and desperate. Some were arguing for surrender, rather than continued resistance that seemed to accomplish nothing except getting more people killed. But we also discovered that our resistance efforts had accomplished more than we realized. The attacks on our cells had required them to commit significant resources and reveal some of their operational methods. More importantly, our broadcasts about the underground facilities had reached survivor networks in other cities, who were beginning to investigate similar operations in their areas. Reports were coming in from resistance networks in Chicago, Atlanta, Phoenix, and other major cities. They were finding similar underground facilities, similar elimination operations, and similar evidence of advanced planning for population reduction. The program wasn't limited to the Denver area. It was being implemented nationally, possibly globally. The coordination required for such a massive operation suggested that this wasn't just a government response to the volcanic winter. This was an international conspiracy involving multiple governments and organizations. The volcanic winter was being used as cover for implementing a new world order that had been planned for years or decades. Intelligence from other cities also revealed that resistance was forming everywhere. Independent survivors had discovered the truth about what was happening. People were fighting back against elimination operations, sharing information about underground facilities, and coordinating efforts to document and expose the population reduction program. The resistance was growing, but so was the violence being used to suppress it. Reports from other cities described increasingly brutal tactics being used against civilian survivors. Mass executions, forced relocations to elimination camps, and the use of starvation and exposure as weapons against entire populations. We realized that our survival depended not just on avoiding elimination in Denver, but on coordinating with resistance networks nationwide to prevent the complete success of the population reduction program. If they succeeded in eliminating all independent survivors, there would be no witnesses to expose what had really happened during the volcanic winter. The remaining Denver resistance members made the decision to transition from defensive survival to active warfare against the elimination operations. We would target their command facilities, disrupt their communication networks, and gather evidence that could be transmitted to resistance networks in other areas. Our first major operation targeted a communication relay station that was coordinating elimination operations across the Front Range region. The facility was located in a government building that was supposed to have been evacuated, but intelligence indicated it was being used as a command center for population reduction operations. The attack was planned as an intelligence gathering mission rather than a destruction operation. We needed to access their communication systems and document their operations without alerting them to our capabilities. If they knew we could penetrate their security, they would implement countermeasures that would make future operations impossible. The facility was more heavily defended than our intelligence had suggested. Professional security teams, surveillance equipment, and communication systems that indicated this was a major operational center rather than just a relay station. We were walking into something much larger and more dangerous than anticipated. But we also discovered that the facility contained detailed operational plans for the entire Western region. Orders for elimination operations, resource allocation schedules, population reduction targets, and timelines for completing the program. The scope was beyond anything we had imagined. The documentation we retrieved revealed that the population reduction program was scheduled for completion within 18 months of the Yellowstone eruption. By that time, independent survivor populations would be eliminated completely. Resources would be consolidated under centralized control. Selected populations would be relocated from underground facilities to begin reoccupying cleared areas. The timeline was aggressive and comprehensive. Phase 1 involved eliminating organized resistance networks. Phase 2 would systematically clear all remaining independent survivors from designated zones. Phase 3 would relocate approved populations to begin rebuilding infrastructure under the new social order. We were currently in the middle of Phase 1 operations. The coordinated attacks on resistance cells were designed to eliminate organized opposition before beginning the systematic clearing of independent survivors. If Phase 1 succeeded, Phase 2 would face no organized resistance. The intelligence we gathered was transmitted to every resistance network we could contact, but we also realized that possessing this information made us extremely high-value targets. The elimination operations would commit whatever resources were necessary to prevent this intelligence from spreading to other survivor populations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of our transmission, Elimination teams were conducting coordinated sweeps of every area where resistance members might be hiding. The attacks were more systematic and thorough than anything we had experienced before. They were implementing Phase 2 operations ahead of schedule to eliminate the resistance before we could spread the intelligence further. We lost contact with most of our remaining resistance cells within 24 hours. Teams that had survived the previous coordinated attacks were being systematically eliminated by operations that used overwhelming force and complete tactical coordination. The resistance network that had taken months to build was being destroyed in a matter of days. I found myself operating almost entirely alone, with minimal equipment and limited communication capabilities. Most of the people I had been coordinating with were either dead or had disappeared into hiding so deep that they couldn't maintain contact with other survivors. But the intelligence we had transmitted was having effects beyond the Denver area. Resistance networks in other cities were using the operational plans we had captured to anticipate and counter elimination operations in their areas. Some were successfully disrupting Phase 1 operations and protecting survivor populations from systematic elimination. The national coordination of resistance efforts was creating problems for the population reduction program that they hadn't anticipated. Instead of dealing with isolated groups of desperate survivors, they were facing coordinated opposition that shared intelligence and tactical information across multiple cities and regions. Reports from other areas indicated that some elimination operations were being forced to withdraw or were suffering significant casualties when they encountered prepared resistance. The program was behind schedule and over budget. Political pressure was building to accelerate operations and commit additional resources to complete the population reduction on schedule. The acceleration of elimination operations created opportunities for resistance networks to gather more intelligence and document more evidence of the systematic nature of the population reduction program. The pressure to complete operations quickly was forcing them to take risks and make mistakes that revealed more information about their organization and methods. Intelligence from multiple cities was being compiled into a comprehensive picture of the population reduction program that could be transmitted internationally to resistance networks in other countries. If similar operations were being conducted globally, resistance networks needed to coordinate internationally to expose and counter the program. But the acceleration of operations also meant that time was running out for independent survivors everywhere. The systematic clearing operations were being implemented with increasing speed and violence. Entire cities were being designated as elimination zones where no survivors would be allowed to remain. I realized that my role was transitioning from local resistance coordination to national intelligence sharing. The equipment and communication capabilities I had maintained were becoming critical for coordinating between resistance networks that were fighting similar operations across the country. The responsibility was overwhelming, but I also understood that this might be the most important work I had ever done. If the resistance networks could coordinate effectively and expose the population reduction program internationally, it might be possible to stop the systematic elimination of independent survivors. Marcus appeared at my current location, just as I was preparing to relocate to avoid detection. He claimed to have escaped from elimination operations and wanted to rejoin the resistance. But his presence at my concealed location, combined with his previous betrayal, made it clear that he was leading another elimination team to my position. I barely escaped the facility before the elimination team arrived. They knew exactly where to look for my equipment and how to neutralize my communication capabilities. Marcus had been providing them with detailed intelligence about my operations and capabilities throughout the entire period I thought he was working with the resistance. The realization that Marcus had been feeding information to elimination operations for weeks meant that much of the intelligence I thought was secure had been compromised from the beginning. Operations that had failed, resistance members who had been captured, security breaches that had seemed like bad luck. All of it could be traced back to his systematic betrayal. But I also realized that Marcus had been in position to provide false information to the elimination operations if I had recognized his betrayal earlier. The opportunity to feed disinformation to their intelligence networks was something that could be used by other resistance cells if they could identify and turn their infiltrators. As I prepared to establish new communication capabilities from a different location, I intercepted radio traffic that revealed the scope of what was happening nationally. The resistance efforts were having significant effects. Multiple cities were reporting successful operations against elimination teams. The population reduction program was falling behind schedule and experiencing organized opposition that was growing stronger rather than weaker. The war for winter had become a war for the future of human civilization. The outcome would determine whether independent human communities would be allowed to survive the volcanic winter, or whether the global population would be reduced to manageable levels under centralized control. We were fighting for the right to exist as free people rather than as managed livestock. The battle was far from over, but we were no longer just trying to survive. We were fighting back, and we were winning some of those fights. The elimination operations had revealed their true nature, and people were refusing to submit to systematic extermination. The resistance was growing, and spring was still months away. We won that battle, but Marcus escaped. And he took something with him: the complete list of survivor locations. The war was escalating, and I could see aircraft engines getting closer on the horizon. The aircraft engines I heard approaching turned out to be cargo planes dropping supplies, but not the kind of humanitarian aid anyone expected. The supply drop was a trap. The collective knew it was coming because they had inside information from the very top levels of whatever government operations were still functioning. The planes dropped pallets of food, medical supplies, and winter equipment in an open area that should have been safe for survivors to approach. But elimination teams were positioned around the entire drop zone, waiting for desperate people to expose themselves trying to reach the supplies. It was psychological warfare designed to use our basic survival needs against us. I watched through binoculars as families emerged from hiding places throughout the area, moving toward the supply pallets, parents carrying children who were weak from malnutrition, elderly people who had been surviving on scraps for weeks. They couldn't resist the opportunity to obtain food and medical supplies, even though the situation felt wrong. The elimination teams waited until dozens of survivors were in the open area before beginning their operation. Systematic execution of every person who had approached the supply drop. No warnings, no opportunity to surrender, no distinction between adults and children. The goal was to eliminate as many independent survivors as possible while demonstrating the futility of resistance. Sarah appeared at my observation position just as the executions began. She grabbed my radio equipment and told me to broadcast everything I was witnessing. "Tell them about the bunkers," she said. "Tell them about what's really happening." Then she disappeared into the smoke rising from the elimination operation below. That transmission became the most important broadcast I had made since the crisis began. Real-time documentation of systematic execution operations being conducted against civilian survivors. Evidence that the supply drops were being used as elimination tools rather than humanitarian assistance. Proof that this was organized extermination rather than crisis management. The broadcast reached resistance networks across multiple states within hours. People who had been considering approaching supply drops in their areas were warned about the tactical use of humanitarian aid as bait for elimination operations. The information saved lives and revealed the sophistication of the psychological warfare being used against survivors. But the broadcast also triggered the most aggressive response I had experienced since the crisis began. Within hours, elimination teams were conducting coordinated sweeps of every area where my transmission might have originated. They were implementing Phase 2 operations ahead of schedule, specifically to eliminate me before I could document him. BROADC additional evidence. The systematic clearing operations that followed were unlike anything we had seen before. Entire city blocks were surrounded and searched building by building. Teams with professional military equipment and tactics were eliminating every survivor they found, regardless of whether those people had any connection to resistance operations. I barely escaped the first sweep by using storm drainage tunnels to move between areas that were being cleared simultaneously. But the elimination teams had detailed maps of the tunnel systems and were using those passages as routes for their own operations. The underground spaces that had provided refuge for survivors were becoming death traps. The few resistance members who survived the systematic clearing operations gathered at an emergency meeting location outside the city. We had lost almost everyone. Most of our equipment was destroyed or abandoned. The survivors who remained were traumatized and desperate. Some were arguing for complete withdrawal from the Denver area, rather than continued resistance that seemed to accomplish nothing except getting people killed. But we also received intelligence that changed our understanding of the entire situation. The documents Sarah had died to obtain revealed that the population reduction program was encountering serious problems in multiple regions. Resistance networks were disrupting operations, exposing evidence internationally, and coordinating opposition that was forcing significant changes to their timeline and methods. The acceleration of elimination operations in Denver wasn't just about eliminating local resistance. It was about completing a test program that would be implemented nationally if it succeeded. Denver was being used as a proving ground for systematic population reduction methods that would be applied to other metropolitan areas. The intelligence also revealed the true scope of international coordination. Similar elimination programs were being implemented simultaneously in multiple countries. Government facilities around the world were coordinating population reduction operations designed to eliminate surplus populations and consolidate resources under centralized control. But resistance was forming internationally as well. Reports from Europe, Asia, and other regions indicated that survivor networks were discovering evidence of systematic elimination programs and coordinating opposition. The population reduction program was facing organized resistance on a global scale. The revelation that this was a global conspiracy rather than just a national emergency response changed our approach to resistance operations. We weren't just fighting for survival in Denver. We were part of an international struggle for the future of human civilization. The coordinates Sarah had given me before her death led to more than just evidence of advanced planning. They led to communication systems that connected resistance networks internationally. Survivors in different countries were sharing intelligence about elimination operations and coordinating efforts to expose and counter the population reduction program. I established contact with resistance networks in Canada, Mexico, European countries, and other regions. The reports were consistent. Systematic elimination of independent survivors, consolidation of resources under government control, and evidence of advanced planning for population reduction operations. The volcanic winter was being used as cover for implementing a new world order globally. The international coordination of resistance efforts revealed that the population reduction program was behind schedule and over budget in most regions. Organized opposition was forcing them to commit additional resources and extend timelines. Political pressure was building within the organizations, implementing the program to accelerate operations and complete population reduction before resistance could become more effective. But the acceleration of operations was also creating opportunities for resistance networks to gather more evidence and coordinate more effective opposition. The pressure to complete elimination operations quickly was forcing mistakes that revealed more information about the organization and methods of the population reduction program. Intelligence from multiple countries was being compiled into a comprehensive documentation of the global population reduction conspiracy. Evidence of advanced planning, coordination between governments, systematic elimination methods, and the use of the volcanic winter as cover for implementing predetermined population control policies. The documentation was being transmitted to every communication network that could reach international audiences. If the evidence could be widely distributed before the elimination operations were completed, it might be possible to expose the conspiracy and generate enough opposition to stop the systematic extermination of independent populations. The response from elimination operations was immediate and global. Coordinated attacks on resistance networks in multiple countries, systematic destruction of communication capabilities, acceleration of elimination operations to complete population reduction before evidence could be widely distributed. But the international coordination of resistance was also accelerating. Networks that had been operating independently were sharing resources, intelligence, and tactical information. Elimination operations that had been successful against isolated resistance were encountering coordinated opposition that could anticipate and counter their methods. Reports from around the world indicated that some elimination operations were being forced to withdraw or were suffering significant casualties when they encountered prepared resistance. The program was falling behind schedule in multiple regions. Resources were being stretched beyond original planning as resistance required additional operations to suppress. The battle for information was becoming as important as the battle for physical survival. The population reduction program required secrecy to maintain political support and operational effectiveness. If the true nature of the operations could be exposed internationally, it might generate enough opposition to stop the systematic elimination of independent populations. I realized that my role had evolved from local survival broadcasting to international intelligence coordination. The communication capabilities I had maintained were becoming critical for sharing information between resistance networks that were fighting similar operations on different continents. The responsibility was enormous, but I also understood that this might be the most important work anyone could do under the circumstances. If the resistance networks could expose the population reduction conspiracy internationally, it might be possible to save millions of lives and preserve independent human communities. The equipment failures and security challenges I was facing were similar to those reported by resistance networks in other countries. Communication systems were being systematically targeted and destroyed. Operators were being identified and eliminated. The technology that enabled international coordination was being attacked as aggressively as the people using it. But new networks were forming faster than old ones could be destroyed. People who discovered evidence of elimination operations were creating communication links with other survivors. The resistance was growing despite the systematic efforts to eliminate it. Intelligence reports indicated that political pressure was building within the organizations implementing the population reduction program. Some participants were questioning the methods being used and the scope of operations. Others were concerned about the international exposure and the risk of organized opposition. The political pressure was creating opportunities for resistance networks to gather intelligence from sources within the elimination operations. People who had been involved in planning or implementing the program were providing information that revealed more details about the organization and methods being used. This intelligence revealed that the population reduction program was not universally supported even within the organizations implementing it. There were factions that favored less aggressive methods, others that questioned the entire concept, and some that were concerned about the long-term consequences of systematic population elimination. The internal divisions within the elimination operations created opportunities for resistance. Networks to exploit disagreements and gather additional intelligence. People who were uncomfortable with the methods being used were potential sources of information and possibly active assistance for resistance efforts. But the intelligence also revealed that the most aggressive factions were gaining influence. As resistance became more effective, people who favored complete elimination of independent populations were arguing for accelerated operations and more violent methods to suppress resistance before it could become more organized. The escalation of violence was creating a situation where resistance networks had to choose between passive survival and active warfare. The elimination operations were becoming more systematic and thorough. Hiding and avoiding detection was becoming less effective as they implemented comprehensive clearing operations. Some resistance networks were transitioning to active sabotage and direct attacks on elimination operations. They were targeting communication systems, supply lines, and operational facilities. The goal was to disrupt the program enough to prevent completion of population reduction operations. The sabotage operations were having significant effects in some regions. Elimination operations were being forced to commit additional resources to security rather than population clearing. Timelines were being extended as operations dealt with active resistance rather than just avoiding detection. But the sabotage was also triggering more aggressive responses from elimination operations. Communities that had no connection to resistance were being eliminated in retaliation for attacks on elimination facilities. The violence was escalating beyond anything that had been planned or anticipated. The escalation created an urgent need for resistance networks to coordinate more effectively and target their operations more precisely. Random sabotage was creating opportunities for retaliation against innocent survivors. Resistance had to become more strategic and selective to avoid triggering responses that would harm non-combatant populations. I was working to coordinate intelligence sharing that would enable resistance networks to target the most critical facilities and operations while avoiding actions that would trigger retaliation against civilian survivors. The goal was to disrupt the population reduction program without providing justification for accelerated elimination operations. The coordination was complicated by the security challenges and the diversity of resistance networks in different regions. People who were fighting for their survival under desperate circumstances were not always able to implement sophisticated tactical coordination. Emergency responses were sometimes more important than strategic planning. But progress was being made in developing more effective resistance coordination. Networks that had been operating independently were sharing information about successful tactics and operations. Elimination operations that had been successful against isolated resistance were encountering coordinated opposition that could anticipate and counter their methods. The resistance was learning faster than the elimination operations could adapt. People who were fighting for their survival were more motivated and flexible than bureaucratic organizations implementing predetermined plans. The advantage was shifting toward resistance networks that could coordinate effectively. Reports from multiple countries indicated that the population reduction program was encountering serious problems that were forcing major changes to operations and timelines. Some regions were abandoning systematic elimination in favor of containment operations, designed to isolate survivor populations rather than eliminate them completely. The shift toward containment rather than elimination was creating new opportunities for resistance networks to establish sustainable communities and coordinate more effective opposition. If survivor populations could be preserved in isolated areas, they might be able to rebuild and challenge the new social order that was being established. But containment also created new challenges for resistance networks. Isolated communities could be more easily controlled and monitored. Resources could be restricted to maintain dependence on centralized distribution systems. Freedom could be eliminated gradually rather than through direct confrontation. The choice between resistance and accommodation was becoming more complex. As elimination operations evolved toward containment strategies, some survivor communities were accepting isolation and resource restrictions in exchange for physical survival. Others were maintaining resistance. Despite the increased risks and challenges, the diversity of responses was creating different outcomes in different regions. Some areas were achieving successful resistance that forced withdrawal of elimination operations. Others were accepting containment that preserved survival but eliminated independence. The future would be determined by which approach proved more sustainable and effective. I realized that my broadcasting was becoming part of the process by which survivor communities made these critical decisions. The information I shared about elimination operations and resistance successes influenced how people evaluated their options and chose their responses to the crisis. The responsibility for providing accurate and useful information was enormous. People were making life and death decisions based on intelligence I transmitted. The consequences of mistakes or misinformation could be catastrophic for entire communities of survivors. But I also understood that information sharing was the most important contribution I could make to the survival of independent human communities. People needed to understand what they were facing and what options were available. They needed to coordinate with other survivor communities to make resistance more effective. The network I had helped establish was connecting survivor communities across multiple continents. People who had been isolated and desperate were discovering that they were part of a global resistance movement. The population reduction program was facing organized opposition on a scale that threatened its success. The opposition was growing stronger while the elimination operations were becoming more difficult and expensive. Political support for the program was declining as evidence of its true nature became more widely known. International pressure was building to stop the systematic elimination of civilian populations. But time was running out for independent survivors everywhere. The systematic clearing operations were continuing despite the resistance. Entire regions were being designated as elimination zones, where no independent communities would be allowed to remain. The race was between effective resistance and complete population reduction. That's my story so far. 93 days of hell, and this is just the beginning. If you're listening to this, find the others. Build the network, and remember, they're not just trying to control the winter. They're trying to control what comes after. This is Ram, and I'll be back tomorrow. Stay alive, stay connected, and stay ready.